There's a moment, and almost every powerful person describes it, where the room goes quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of respect, not the quiet of admiration. Something colder. Something that sits just beneath the surface of every handshake, every smile, every congratulation. It's the moment you realize you can no longer tell who actually likes you. Think about that. Truly think about it. You have climbed. You have fought. You have sacrificed years, relationships, sleep, and something you used to call your personality. And you have arrived at the top of whatever mountain you chose to climb. And standing there, surrounded by more people than you've ever known, more access than you've ever had, more invitations and phone calls and deference than you dreamed possible, you are more alone than you have ever been in your life.
This is not a metaphor. This is not poetic suffering dressed up for dramatic effect. This is a documented, repeated, almost universal psychological experience reported by presidents, billionaires, executives, celebrities, and emperors across 3,000 years of recorded history. Power doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes your perception of reality. It rewires the way you read people. It makes trust feel like a gamble you can no longer afford. And it turns genuine human connection into the one thing your position makes almost structurally impossible. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this 500 years ago, and what he wrote, quietly, dangerously, in a small manuscript that would get him arrested and tortured, was not a manual for cruelty. It was a warning. Before you had anything, friendships were simple, or at least they felt simple. You called someone when you needed to talk, you showed up uninvited, you borrowed money, you argued, you were honest, sometimes painfully so, because the relationship could bear the weight of honesty, because there was no calculus happening beneath the surface, no invisible ledger being tracked. Then things change, maybe gradually, maybe suddenly. A promotion, a public success, a company that works, a platform that grows, and almost imperceptibly, the social world around you begins to shift. People start being nicer to you, and at first, this feels wonderful. The emails become warmer, the invitations multiply. People who barely acknowledged you before now make deliberate eye contact. They laugh a little harder at your jokes. They agree with you more. They seem genuinely interested, fascinated even, in what you think, what you're doing, where you're going. And here is where the trap is set. Because human beings are deeply social creatures, we are wired at a neurological level to interpret warmth as genuine interest, to interpret agreement as connection, to interpret presence as loyalty. Our brains cannot easily distinguish between a person who likes us and a person who needs something from us and has learned that being likable is the most efficient path to getting it. This is not cynicism, this is social psychology, and it creates a reality for powerful people that is genuinely disorienting. The more influential you become, the less reliable your emotional data becomes.
Consider what happens in the court of nearly any powerful organization. There's a well-documented phenomenon researchers call opinion conformity under hierarchy, the tendency of people at lower levels of a power structure to align their stated opinions with whoever holds authority above them. Not because they're dishonest, not necessarily because they're calculating, but because subordination is psychologically uncomfortable, and agreement is the fastest way to reduce that discomfort. In practice, what this means is that the powerful person begins to exist in an increasingly artificial social environment. People tell them what they want to hear. They shield them from criticism. They perform enthusiasm. They curate their behavior around what they believe the powerful person wants to see. And the powerful person, if they are self-aware enough, begins to notice this, and they cannot stop noticing it. Julius Caesar noticed it. He was famously surrounded by people who praised him, senators, soldiers, citizens, and was also famously incapable of knowing which of those people genuinely admired him and which were already sharpening a blade. Henry VIII noticed it so acutely that he began executing people who showed even the faintest sign of independent will. His court became a theater of performed devotion, where survival depended not on ability or loyalty, but on the skill of appearing loyal. Howard Hughes, one of the wealthiest men in American history, spent the final years of his life in sealed hotel rooms, refusing contact, eating almost nothing, convinced that everyone around him was either lying to him, stealing from him, or both. These are not outliers. These are case studies in what happens when access to power destroys access to truth.
In 1513, a man sat under house arrest in a small farmhouse ever produced. Niccolo Machiavelli had been a diplomat, a military strategist, and a senior official of the Florentine Republic. He had met popes and kings. He had watched alliances form and dissolve overnight. He had seen men executed, not because they were disloyal, but because they appeared disloyal at the wrong moment. He had been tortured on a rack, literally stretched, for alleged conspiracy against the Medici family, a charge he denied until his death. When he sat down to write The Prince, he was not writing philosophy in the abstract. He was writing from inside the machine. And what he observed, with a clarity that 5 centuries have not managed to dull, is this: power and trust are structurally incompatible. Not personally incompatible, not occasionally incompatible, structurally incompatible, built into the logic of what power is and how it operates.
His reasoning was precise. A prince, any leader, any person at the apex of authority, is surrounded by people whose welfare depends on that prince's goodwill, which means every interaction is already compromised. Every advisor who tells the prince the truth risks the prince's displeasure. Every courtier who flatters the prince gains in the short term. Every associate who challenges the prince's decisions has something to lose and very little to gain. The rational strategy for everyone around power, Machiavelli observed, is performance. Calculated, sustained, expert performance. And therefore, the rational strategy for the person holding power is suspicion. Not paranoia in the clinical sense, operational suspicion. The cold, ongoing, exhausting assumption that the performance is always happening, and that genuine loyalty is nearly impossible to distinguish from performed loyalty without a crisis to test it. He wrote, in essence, that the powerful prince must learn to interpret the world strategically rather than emotionally. He must assume that affection is conditional, that friendship is functional, that loyalty lasts only as long as incentives align.
This is what people mean when they call Machiavelli dark. Not that he celebrated cruelty, not that he endorsed manipulation for its own sake, but that he refused to let sentimentality obscure what he had actually observed about human behavior under conditions of hierarchy. And his observation was simple and devastating. The higher you rise, the lonelier the epistemology. You don't just become lonely in the emotional sense. You become lonely in the informational sense. You lose access to truth. You lose access to unfiltered reality. You lose the ability to know what people actually think, actually feel, actually intend. Power gives you the world, and it takes away your ability to read it.
There's a concept in organizational psychology called the CEO bubble. Researchers use it to describe the informational isolation that forms around executives the more powerful they become. As a leader rises, information begins to travel upward through layers of human interpretation. Each layer filters out what seems too negative, too complicated, too threatening to the leader's existing worldview. By the time information reaches the top, it has been so thoroughly processed, sanitized, softened, reframed, that it barely resembles reality. The leader then makes decisions based on this corrupted picture. And when those decisions produce poor outcomes, those outcomes are themselves filtered on the way back up. This is a structural problem, and it produces a particular kind of psychological suffering. Because powerful people are not stupid. Many of them are extraordinarily perceptive.
They know on some level that the picture they're receiving is curated. They sense the gap between what they're being told and what is actually true. And this creates a specific and corrosive form of paranoia. Not the paranoia of someone who imagines threats, but the paranoia of someone who has accurate reason to suspect that their social reality is being managed without their consent.
Robert Caro, who spent decades chronicling the psychology of power through the life of Lyndon Johnson, observed something quietly extraordinary. The more powerful Johnson became, the more obsessively he studied the faces around him, searching for the micro-expressions of deception. He had aides whose sole function was to sit in rooms he wasn't in and report back what people said when they thought he couldn't hear. He was consumed by the question of who was real. This is not a personality disorder. Or rather, it becomes a personality disorder over time, but it doesn't begin as one. It begins as a rational response to an irrational environment. When your social world is genuinely full of performance, when the incentive structure genuinely rewards deception, learning to read deception is simply adaptation. The tragedy is what this adaptation costs. It costs the ability to relax. The powerful person can no longer simply be in a room. Every room is a chess game. Every relationship is a variable to be managed. Every compliment requires decoding. Every gesture of friendship triggers the quiet, exhausting question: what do they want? And here is the thing that almost never gets discussed. This question, once activated, never fully goes back to sleep. Even in spaces that should be safe, even with people who have given no evidence of ulterior motives, even alone, the paranoid logic of power doesn't clock out. It becomes the default mode of processing reality, because the stakes are high enough and the cost of being wrong has been demonstrated repeatedly enough that the brain simply stops trusting its own positive interpretations. Psychologists call this hypervigilant attachment, a state in which early experiences of betrayal or instrumental relationships reprogram the nervous system to treat genuine connection as a threat. In powerful people, this isn't always about childhood. It develops in real time through the accumulated experience of watching people perform loyalty and then defect the moment the calculus changed. Napoleon Bonaparte reportedly said, near the end of his life, that he had never truly known a single friend. He qualified this almost immediately. He had known companions, allies, brilliant minds, courageous men. But friends, in the sense of people whose care for him was entirely independent of what he represented, he was no longer sure such people existed in his orbit. The loneliness he was describing wasn't situational, it was ontological, a loneliness baked into what he had become.
There is a particular kind of human relationship that power makes nearly impossible. Not love, though power complicates love in its own ways. Not respect. Power produces enormous quantities of respect, or at least its simulacrum. The relationship power makes nearly impossible is equality. And without equality, genuine connection cannot exist. Think about what happens in an unequal relationship. One person needs something from the other. The interaction is shaped, sometimes subtly, sometimes overwhelmingly, by that need. Every decision the less powerful person makes is filtered through the question of how it will be received by the more powerful one. They edit themselves. They perform. They optimize. The powerful person receiving this performance knows it's happening. They have seen it too many times to pretend otherwise. They may appreciate the loyalty, the deference, the careful management, but they cannot mistake it for what they actually want, which is someone who would simply tell them the truth, simply be with them, simply care about them in a way that has nothing to do with what they can provide.
Envy compounds this, because the other side of the coin of performed loyalty is silent envy. And powerful people, if they are perceptive, feel this too. The courtier who smiles at their success and privately resents it. The subordinate who agrees publicly and complains privately. The associate who celebrates with them and returns home to the slow burn of comparison. Envy is almost never expressed directly to power. It is suppressed, masked, converted into forms that look like admiration or engagement. But it is present, and powerful people develop over time an uncomfortable sensitivity to its texture. They begin to sense the resentment beneath the applause, the coldness behind the warmth. This is particularly true in cultures, and the present one qualifies, where wealth and status are highly visible, where the gap between the powerful and everyone else is enormous, and where that gap has been normalized as an almost natural feature of the social landscape. In such environments, the powerful person exists in a specific kind of glass house, visible to everyone, studied by everyone, envied by most, genuinely understood by almost no one.
The philosopher Simone Weil wrote that affliction, genuine suffering, is isolating because it is incomprehensible to those who have not experienced it. Power works the same way, but inversely. Its pleasures are incomprehensible to those who haven't felt them. Its burdens are invisible to those who are too busy envying the privileges to notice the cost. And so the powerful person carries their isolation in silence, because to express it, to admit to loneliness from a position of wealth, access, and authority, is to invite incomprehension, or contempt, or the particularly sharp sting of being told that your suffering is illegitimate because of what you have. So they say nothing. They perform wellness. They perform satisfaction. They perform the version of themselves that the world needs to see, at the same time that everyone around them is performing the version of themselves that they need to see. An entire social ecosystem of mutual performance, with genuine connection somewhere outside the frame.
We don't need to reach into history to find this pattern. It is playing out, visibly and almost continuously, in the culture we inhabit right now. Consider what we know, not from gossip, but from documented accounts, authorized biographies, and the occasional moment of unguarded honesty about the inner lives of people who have reached the apex of modern power. Elon Musk, by the testimony of people who have worked closely with him, exists in a state of near total operational isolation. Not physical isolation, he's surrounded by people at all times, but cognitive isolation. The people around him have learned, systematically, that contradiction is dangerous, that skepticism is unwelcome, that the safest professional strategy is agreement. And so he has assembled, around himself, an environment in which his thinking is almost never genuinely challenged, which is, for a man of his intelligence, a form of solitary confinement.
Mark Zuckerberg, in interviews over many years, has described his difficulty forming close relationships with a kind of clinical detachment that itself reveals the depth of the problem. Here is a man who built the world's largest social platform, who has connected more human beings to each other than any individual in history, and who has described his own social life in terms so sparse, so transactional, so carefully managed, that the irony is almost literary. Steve Jobs was documented by people who admired and loved him, not just those who criticized him, as someone who used emotional intensity as a weapon, who made himself impossible to know because knowing required a vulnerability his position made unbearable. His daughter's memoir describes a man whose capacity for beauty and vision was matched, almost precisely, by his incapacity for ordinary human warmth. These are not failures of character. That framing misses the point entirely. These are predictable outcomes of a particular kind of environment, sustained over a long enough period of time. When you operate at sufficient levels of power and visibility, several things happen simultaneously. Every interaction carries stakes. Every relationship is embedded in a web of incentives. Every piece of feedback you receive is filtered through the awareness that the person giving it has something to gain or lose depending on your reaction. The social feedback mechanisms that normal human beings rely on to calibrate themselves, the honest friend, the uncomfortable conversation, the person who tells you when you're wrong, are systematically removed from your environment.
Not through conspiracy, through the perfectly ordinary logic of self-preservation. And without that feedback, without that friction, something starts to happen to a person's relationship with reality itself. They become less calibrated, more certain, more surrounded by versions of events that confirm rather than challenge their existing picture. Jeff Bezos, in an internal Amazon document that later became something of a management legend, described his fear of what he called day two, the moment an organization becomes too comfortable, too self-referential, too insulated from the external reality that once disciplined it. He was describing institutional complacency, but the psychological parallel is exact. Day two for a powerful person is the day the isolation becomes total, the day the last honest voice either leaves or falls silent, the day the performance becomes the only available reality.
Some never reach it. The ones who don't are almost always people who have made a deliberate, sustained, costly effort to preserve access to truth. By keeping relationships that predate their power, by actively seeking out people who are genuinely not impressed by them, by building structures that protect their ability to receive honest feedback, even when it's uncomfortable. But the effort required is immense, because the gravitational pull of isolation is constant, because every system around power tends naturally toward the production of comfort rather than the production of truth.
Here is something that almost never gets discussed in conversations about power. The aspiration to power is nearly universal. The detailed accounting of its psychological costs is almost non-existent. We construct elaborate narratives about the benefits of power, the access, the influence, the resources, the ability to shape the world according to your vision. We admire it, we pursue it. We consume content about the people who have it with a hunger that suggests we believe, on some level, that understanding their lives might bring us closer to their reality. But the internal architecture of that reality, the paranoia, the isolation, the slow erosion of genuine connection, the inability to trust, the performance that never ends, the question that never fully resolves. This part of the story rarely makes it into the mythology. And this matters, not because power is not worth pursuing. That's too simple a conclusion, and a cowardly one. But because pursuing it without understanding its costs is like signing a contract without reading the terms.
The contract of power is this. In exchange for influence over the external world, you will experience a progressive loss of access to the internal world, to honest relationships, to unguarded moments, to the simple, unremarkable experience of being known by someone who has nothing to gain from knowing you. You will gain the ability to move markets and people and governments. You will lose the ability to know with any confidence whether the person sitting across from you actually gives a damn about you as a human being. Machiavelli understood this as an almost mathematical inevitability. It wasn't a critique, it wasn't a moral judgment. It was an observation about the geometry of power, that the same elevation that expands your view of the world below narrows the field of people capable of reaching you where you actually are. And he made one further observation, perhaps his darkest, that tends to get lost in discussions of his work. He observed that the most effective response to this reality, the strategic response, the response most likely to preserve both power and sanity, is a kind of deliberate, cultivated self-sufficiency. The powerful person who survives, who maintains clarity, who continues to make effective decisions despite the epistemic isolation, is the one who learns not to need the validation that their position will never honestly provide. Not to stop wanting it, not to cease being human enough to hunger for genuine connection, but to operate despite that hunger. To function without the emotional sustenance that most people take for granted. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that a prince must be both lion and fox. Not merely powerful and clever, but willing to inhabit the cold, precise, unsentimental logic of power, while remaining human enough to understand its emotional consequences on the people around him. It is an almost impossible balance, and it explains, in part, why the history of power is also a history of breakdown, of tyrants who became paranoid, of visionaries who became isolated,
of brilliant people who were slowly destroyed not by their enemies, but by the psychological climate their own success created.
Here is the truth underneath all of this. Power is not the villain of this story. Power reveals. It takes whatever is already present in a person, the capacity for paranoia, for generosity, for cruelty, for isolation, for connection, and amplifies it. Strips away the ordinary social constraints that keep people performing the expected version of themselves. And what's left is something rawer, truer, more difficult to manage. The isolation of power is not a punishment. It is a consequence, a structural consequence of being placed in a position where the normal mechanisms of human trust cannot function, where the people around you have too much to gain from your approval and too much to lose from your displeasure to ever be entirely honest with you. And here is the thing that sits at the very center of this entire story, the thing that Machiavelli saw, and almost no one who reads him actually sits with long enough.
The pursuit of power is, at its root, a pursuit of significance, of mattering, of having your existence register in the world in some durable, visible way. We want to be important because importance feels like the solution to the terrible smallness that most human beings quietly live with. The sense that our lives are unremarkable, our voices unheard, our presence barely noticed. Power promises to solve this, and in many ways, it delivers. The powerful person is noticed, is heard, is felt in the decisions of institutions and the trajectories of industries and the lives of people they will never meet. But the deepest form of significance, the one that actually fills the hunger, the one that makes the smallness tolerable, is not to matter to the world. It is to matter to someone, to be known fully, without performance, without calculation, to have at least one relationship where the question of what you can provide is entirely irrelevant, where your presence, exactly as it is enough. This is what power tends to take.
Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, inexorably, as the incentive structures around you shift and the honest voices go quiet and the careful performances replace the real conversations. And you realize one day, sitting at the top of whatever you have built, that you cannot remember the last time someone told you something you didn't want to hear. That is the loneliness, not the absence of people, the absence of truth. Julius Caesar died surrounded by senators. Howard Hughes died surrounded by aides. Alexander the Great died at 32, having conquered more of the world than any human being before him, surrounded by soldiers who worshipped him and advisors who feared him, and by most accounts, almost no one who knew him. They had everything, and they were alone in the specific, devastating way that only power can produce, in a crowd, in broad daylight, with all the access and resources and influence in the world.
Alone in the one place that power cannot reach, the place where genuine love, genuine trust, genuine knowledge of another person actually lives. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince as a celebration of this reality. He wrote it as a map, a cold, honest map of a territory that almost everyone pretends is warmer than it is. And the map shows the same thing, over and over, across 5 centuries of readers and 5,000 years of human history. Power gives you the world, and the world is very, very quiet.